Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the two panelists. I have with me today Ms. Averil Ludowyke. She is the fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka and the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, both SEMA as well, with over 26 years at Ernst & Young, including 11 as partner. She now serves as an independent non-executive director at Ceylon Bank, Selenco Insurance, and Boogala Graphite. She has significant experience in forensic auditing and integrity services, leading investigations, compliance, and fraud prevention efforts. She has also been a lead audit partner for various companies and has conducted numerous seminars and training programs on forensic auditing and corporate compliance. We are really happy to have you. Accompanying her is Ms. Rukshani Wanigasekara. She is an attorney at law in Sri Lanka. She currently serves as the senior manager corporate legal at Cargills Private PLC. She holds an LLM from National University of Singapore, specializing in intellectual property and information technology law. She also has an LLB from the University of London and a postgraduate diploma in corporate law from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. She is an active member of the Asian Patent Attorneys Association and currently serves as the Emerging Rights Committee on the Emerging Rights Committee as the representative of Sri Lanka's recognized group. Welcome, both of you. I think we have a fairly short time to explore this complex issue. We have been presented with the stark fact, which not that we are not familiar with, of the prevalence of corruption in the private sector. But now I think we would like to move the conversation and discussion on how do we deal with it, or how do we kind of address it. And she did in her final presentation, in terms of moving forward or in recommendation, the first two kind of really gives us a springboard for this conversation. Namely, on the one hand, setting up systems of compliance, and on the other hand, improving the business integrity or the business culture. So those are kind of two important recommendations that have come out. So if we are to further explore that, which we will be doing, may I kind of ask you to set the tone, or start off by what you understand to be kind of approaching it through an integrity prism versus approaching it through a compliance prism. How do you kind of differentiate between the two? And how do you differentiate between mere compliance, box ticking kind of exercise, as the panel title says, versus kind of fostering genuine business integrity? May I first ask Averil?
Okay, so I must say that Michelle's research was pretty comprehensive, very thorough, and I think she has covered most of the points. So integrity should be at the very heart of the business. And she mentioned tone at the top. So that is the mantra really, where the board of directors, the senior management should be committed to not just compliance, but building integrity into the organization. Because any organization can be compliant and still pay a lot of bribes, because accountants are very clever at hiding it in the books, right? So integrity has to be at the heart, where directors are committed and they should first understand what corruption is. It's a wide definition, and so many areas are captured under that, and they need to understand that each of those areas should be basically addressed in the organization, and training, continuous training, which Michelle mentioned, right? And also sanction the people who are found to be non-compliant, who have indulged in corruption. So that's in a nutshell.
Same thing, Rukshani. How do you see it? How do you differentiate between the compliance part of it and and the integrity kind of culture aspects of it?
Sure. I'm audible, right?
Yes.
Okay. Firstly, thank you to TISL for inviting to be a part of this panel discussion, and congratulations on the launch. As Avril mentioned, it was quite comprehensive, the presentation, and very interesting, and most points were covered, which we would be also touching on. But in terms of integrity versus compliance, if I were to very simply, in simpler terms, explain, I would say integrity is more driven by a moral compass, and it is doing the right thing even when nobody's watching. As opposed to compliance, it's more rule-based, where you have to follow the laws, regulations, and policies, whether set by an external body or an internally for governance purposes. But if you don't comply, there's always like a consequence, either like a legal sanction or organizational repercussion. So while compliance and integrity both are important in an organization, just mere compliance, I would say, sets sort of a culture of minimalism, if I may say. It would sort of make the employees do the bare minimum to ensure that they're compliant, but not necessarily promote a culture of integrity. If I were to sort of further elaborate with a very simple example, say a company has a zero gift giving policy, and employee A is approached with a gift by a supplier, then that person would say no to it because there is a policy, plus it's the right thing to do. But another person may say no to it merely because they're fearing punishment, not because they are like their moral, internally, their ethical standards say that it's the wrong thing to do, because secretly they may think that, oh, what if I took it? What would be the benefits I get? So integrity and compliance, I would say integrity is much broader, and integrity is the way to go in an organization, and that should be established. There should be a balance of both. A person not necessarily, I would say, has integrity just because they're compliant. So you have to foster the culture of integrity, which is beyond compliance, which we are discussing today as well.
No, certainly, I think we do agree, or, I don't think there is any disagreement per se in terms of the importance of, both rules, regulations, and, and ensuring compliance, and then, also having, a culture of integrity. That's kind of, that both have to be in place is not in question. But the issue at hand, though, is how do you promote, how do you use these in order to address the core issue of, corruption and bribery? What role does each play? And how do you kind of, ensure that, each reinforce each other? And, how are we going to kind of, do that? So to take that aspect a little further, may I kind of, ask you, because you've been doing a lot of forensic audit, it says. So, as an expert on forensic audit, experience across, various sectors, how do you think, the compliance processes and, and the rules-based kind of, frameworks and subsequently kind of looking at it and then sanctioning, how does it help maintain integrity within? So how do you get compliance to help in your integrity space? And what have you observed in terms of, examples? You've done in a number of, may not, be disclosing names, but what have you kind of, found out to be good practice? What has been your experience over the several years, if you can share with us?
Yeah. Okay, so many of the audits we did were on behalf of multinationals who are scoped under the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act. So they just absolutely had to be compliant, because otherwise they could either lose their license, or, particularly they were a subsidiary or an associate or a dealer, they had some connection with multinationals which were scoped under those acts. So they were compliant, and there were regular audits which we had to conduct. We looked at particular areas. For instance, bribes could be channeled through advertising campaigns, through travel agencies, through dealers and distributors. So there are ways in which these are channeled. overpriced government contracts. You overprice a contract, the money is paid by the government, and then out it goes in some other manner. So particular areas were looked at from the compliance point of view, and they either passed or failed. But I have found that what really works is good training programs for the staff, continuous training, so that the staff are told very clearly what is good behavior and what is bad, right? And what fraud is. So training is not only on bribery and corruption, but fraud also. And a good whistleblower mechanism. So companies that had a very robust mechanism, I have found that employees actually speak up and they report fraud, right? And that helps to protect the organization. You're able to deal with it as soon as it's discovered and take action. So the tone at the top, policies are fine. So you might find that about maybe only about 40% of the companies that have good policies, where the employees are aware of the policies, okay? So there has to be continuous training. And I always advocate training which is not just classroom training, but little videos. I have seen some super ones on TikTok, right? It gives the message in just, in a minute, you get the message. So send those out to your employees and encourage reporting. Some companies are very scared about employees, reporting through the hotline. But in the long run, that really protects the organization. So those are just two measures that I found are very effective.
Thank you very much. Rukshani, I think, Averil started off with the two kind of countries, right? The US and the UK, and people working in foreign companies, and that kind of sets a slight tone. But then that's more of a compliance issue, right? If you're working for those companies with contracts, either a subsidiary or kind of having relationship, then you have to follow them, and that then sets in motion a set of processes which kind of lifts the game up. In the absence of that, right, the same Sri Lankan people, same Sri Lankan kind of accountant, finance people, marketeers, working for Sri Lankan company, in the absence of that kind of a hold, in the presence of only the Sri Lankan legal framework, which probably does not have as much teeth on business kind of day-to-day business relations as the two she had mentioned, how do you then kind of foster integrity? How do you kind of get an integrity system going in order to kind of meet kind of the same standard as someone who is working in a company which is servicing US and UK clients?
It's a good question. I would start off saying the same thing as Avril said, irrespective of whether it's an international company or a local company. I would think that the leadership of the company, starting from the board and then the executive management to the key personnel and going right to the shop floor to the junior most employees, the rest of the team members, that tone has to be set at the leadership level. That commitment should come from there. Then it cascades down. So that's very, very important and vital. Whether you're a homegrown Sri Lankan company or whether it's an international company, I don't see the difference in that sense. If there's a strong leadership, I could say from the personal experience from how it is set at the leadership level and there's monthly meetings and it is continuously communicated at that same core values of the organization is continuously spoken of and cascaded down to the next level of team members. So that's very important. And as I mentioned, the values need to be very clear as well. Now, what is integrity? Can one may question? It could be doing the right thing, but what is the right thing? So she also mentioned that there needs to be a lot of training and communication, educating the employees and the team members, saying that this is it. In our company, we have an online training platform. I've mentioned this in previous instances as well, where there are very interactive options. It's not just for these corruption-related things. For any company training programs, there are quizzes where you match the pictures. So not just like classroom session. It's more interactive. Anybody can access it on their phone, just logging through your employee code. That's one way of sort of doing training in a more fun way, where it just you absorb it, because not everyone might have the same level of comprehension, but everyone should be able to differentiate between what is right and wrong, and not to engage in corrupt practices. But we should be very mindful who the audience is at different levels, how you feed in that information. So that's one thing, training and education. And you have to have an open system of communication, where everybody should feel comfortable. If they see something unethical, or if there is anything, they should feel comfortable and free to reach even the senior most management. So there has to be, again, like you mentioned, a robust whistleblower policy. If there is a negative connotation, once I heard another company saying that they call it the speak up policy. So you could call it either way, as long as you sort of educate them and say that this is there, and you have the option of coming to the management or whoever, the ethical committee, then that's a good way of sort of promoting integrity and ethical behavior. Then I would also say that if someone demonstrates an act of integrity, you have to recognize it, and it could be brought about in performance evaluations, and not just meeting your KPIs and sales targets or profit-oriented things. Michelle also touched on it, that I think you should sort of evaluate them and recognize them, which encourages other employees also to see that, okay, the company is recognizing it and giving it value. Otherwise, one would think that, okay, why am I doing something, whereas the other person is doing something wrong and getting away? So that's very important as well. Then transparent policies and procedures should also be there. I would also say that there should be engagement with the stakeholders to understand what they expect of companies to be ethical. The company alone just deciding, thinking that this is the right way to go, may not be the approach. So we have to be attentive, give that ear to others, and see what would be the best way forward, and incorporate it into your day-to-day decision making or sort of day-to-day operations. Integrity should be integral to the operations, is what I think, and it should be more of a way of life. Whether it's the corporation or whether it's the public sector or individuals, my personal belief that it should be embedded into one system, so then it becomes the norm than the exception.
Certainly, it's kind of, getting that culture kind of, going. Before I open up, and as the audience, maybe having, a few questions, you can think of a few questions. Let me kind of, ask a quick question to Averil. In that, these measures are done in a context, right? So this company is not an isolated kind of, unit. It's competing with other companies. It is competing in a sector. So in that kind of an environment, where, there is a race to the bottom tendency, then holding or being a company with integrity may give you the awards at the TISL function, but then the bottom line kind of kicks in fairly soon as well, right? So they have to be dealing with the customs, they have to be dealing with the excise department, they have to be dealing with whole range. So how do you see that kind of what do you see the role of collectives? How do you see the business, a conducive business environment to be fostered in the sector? How do you see that, and have you had any experience discussing those?
Yeah, so certain sectors, of course, are very prone to corruption. One is the construction sector, and so they do have a chamber of their own, and they should work together, because the larger construction companies may not necessarily have to indulge in corruption, because they would anyway get their tenders. They get paid directly by the ADB, and so they are fairly okay when it comes to their business interests. But it's all of the smaller entities who feel that they have to pay a bribe in order to secure a contract. So perhaps they can work with their chambers to collectively bring in this culture of integrity into that sector. So certain sectors, I mean, there are others also, I will not name them all, they could work collectively to basically say no. And if everyone says no, then no will happen, right? So we can bring in a culture of integrity. So, I mean, recently a lot of people have been pushing for, like stop corruption, but they don't realize that corruption is right at home. So I would say there are 22 million corrupt people in this country. They just need to understand where they are corrupt and stop that. Bribing of a principal to get the child into school, it starts with that. So all 22 million have to look within and see what they personally need to do to stop. So like this, the chambers have to work together and say that we will not do it and protect the smaller businesses also within their enclave.
No, good. Thanks for those points. Now, may I open open the floor for questions? While there may be larger kind of rules, regulatory kind of framework, training and awareness, whistleblowing practices, and and the culture of integrity. There are various kind of aspects to getting each company to improve its performance as far as this thorny issue or area is concerned. We have two people who have been part of addressing that, and who have very good experience in addressing that. So if there are, including some TikTok suggestions. So if there are any questions that the audience have to the two panelists, this is your time.
Can I?
Yes, Krishna. Right?
Yes, hi,
Yes.
hi, Gowthaman. And thank you for the very interesting conversation. My name is Krishna. I represent an organization called Strategic Inspirations. Quick question to the panelists, but also to the moderator. What role do you think civil society can play in holding the private sector accountable? And by civil society, I mean broader, not just organizations like TISL, but more broadly. Thank you.
Would one of you like to take that question? Rukshani or Averil? Yeah.
Yeah, so very simply, a civil society has to speak up when they see acts of corruption. Now, I think on the CBOC hotline also they can report this. Recently, I had a problem. I had to get my survey plan approved. It took 4 months, and then I was asked a bribe. So I said, I don't pay bribes, I don't receive bribes, I'm very sorry. And finally, it went through the process. So perhaps civil society needs to speak up. Many people told me, you just got to pay it, you'll never get your survey plan approved. And I said, no, I have never done it, I'm not going to do it now. So I think people have to just take that stand and get together and report acts of corruption on the CBOC hotline. Yeah, so that's my very simplistic solution.
Sentiments, that's what Avril says, that you have to speak up. And I think your question was also like, what would you do for the against the private sector, if I'm not mistaken? Whole private. So yeah, speaking up and complaining and ensuring that your complaint is heard, and then the actions could be taken from there on, is what I could also say.
Since you also asked whether the moderator has a view on it, yeah. No, I think the civil society could play a number of roles, right? And I think the exercise today that TISL is doing, in terms of doing some research and and putting it out there, and and having a conversation around it and raising awareness, that's a very important part. And then, in corruption, particularly on the public sector corruption, which we are very preoccupied with, the supply side is very often the private sector. So if you are kind of, being genuine about, and, and if the civil society kind of, pursues that to its logical conclusion, keeps and, ensures that it moves to prosecution at the prosecution level, then that puts the pressure not only on the public authorities concerned, but it also then, percolates to pressure on the private sector. So I think I would take on from what Avril said, the country, as a country, will have to make certain decisions, right? There are certain turning points, which happen, and every other country, be it US, be it China, be it, everyone has kind of, come through this, this gilded kind of, age type of scenario. So we are in that kind of a moment. So it is civil society's role in being able to do that, in being able to kind of, take leadership and, voice out and hold the rulers accountable, and by way of doing that ensure that the private sector also is held accountable. But that's all in terms of things that had happened, and on the prosecutorial or the post facto fact side of things. But civil society, I believe, also has a big role in the preventive side, in terms of, raising awareness, in terms of, taking the messages to the schools, to kind of, the universities, and, and ensuring that the next generation that is coming up comes up with a better awareness, and as she pointed out, a moral compass, which is much more clearly pointed in terms of, this particular issue.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think you made a very interesting point. In fact, this is something I also personally believe in, that the change makers are the children who are going to be the future leaders and the professionals. So integrity, the subject we are talking about, should be started at a very young age as well. So then it automatically, when they grow up and become professionals, it's instilled and embedded in them, and hopefully we can hope for a corruption-free society and world. So it should be encouraged at that very young age as well.
Yeah, certainly. Any other questions? Yes.
My name's Dennis Western. I'm from USAID here in Sri Lanka, and I certainly want to extend my thanks to the entire panel for your comments here today. I've actually worked in quite a few countries, always seen issues with corruption, and they also tend to be exactly the same issues, country to country, regardless. And one of the key aspects is that it's very difficult to separate any one piece of the problem from others. And something I had not seen here today, you've kind of alluded to a little bit, but is the justice system. And I'd be very curious to hear your comments on like the role that the justice system can, does, and should play in fighting corruption here in Sri Lanka.
Would one of you want to take the call? This is the role of the justice system in addressing corruption.
I'm actually not competent to comment on that. I know that many of our cases of corruption never went to the courts at all. They were never reported because a criminal case would take over 10 years to even get to the courts. And sometimes our report would have gone into storage and we couldn't even find it when the case actually did finally end up in court. So I would just, as a layman, I would think that there has to be a huge improvement in dealing with these cases, concluding them very quickly. So perhaps a lawyer may be able to better explain that.
Yeah, sure.
If you have any points to add, please.
Yeah, sure. I would say the justice system, it's not perfect. There could be rooms for improvement, and there are delays. But it is of recent we see that there are more cases which are being addressed and being brought to attention, and in the news we see that there is more proactive action being taken. But having said that, I would say that there's hugely vast improvement for people and the justice system and the lawyers and everybody to take an active step and to ensure that the law is enforced, not just that the statutes and the acts are there, but it should be also enforced and active measures are taken for enforcement. In terms of corruption, I recently read that there have been many cases, but however most of it have not been gone to, like they've closed it. They have not sort of taken the next step. Now, why has that happened? Because there had been intervention in between. I'm not too sure, I can't comment on that, but I agree completely that the legal system, being in the profession as well, that there needs to be improvement, but I see a positive step towards it. I hope it would continue.
Certainly, the justice system does have a role, but the confidence in the system, based on past experience, does not seem to be, very high. but currently the mood is positive in that the legal framework, the new Anti-Corruption Act, the legal framework that it has now given, it empowers the CBOC much better. And there are a few more laws, which are also on the pipeline, including the Proceeds of Crimes Act. So we're looking at a fairly, robust framework. And then the in the past, the cases that were withdrawn, there were a lot of allegations of meddling or influencing that had prevented the cases from proceeding to their logical conclusion. So given the mandate with which this new government has come, maybe there would be increased attention to this, which can kind of see a gradual improvement over the period. Yeah, so may I take one final question from the gentleman over there? Can you identify you by name and?
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't know it was the final question. Now I'm feeling a bit of pressure. But I was just curious. So firstly, sorry to identify, Kaif Saleh from the UN Global Compact Network Sri Lanka. So from the little bit of the studying and research I have done, there are some interesting cases where technology is being used to sort of combat corruption. So for example, /G, so software as a service of government, so tracking systems, even blockchain is being used, and there is some talk, while I'm no expert, of artificial intelligence algorithms being able to be used for monitoring as well. So the technology is there, but I think the obvious concerns are things like human rights, privacy, and also, of course, political will for either government or top-level corporates to take up this sort of monitoring. So my question is, do we have that environment now? And if we don't, how could we get there so that this sort of technology could be potentially adapted? Because there are a lot of success stories abroad. Thank you.
Would one of you want to take on? Yeah. Use it. Yeah. Yes.
Understood your question right, very simply, please correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying that there are technological advances and there are different platforms and monitoring mechanisms, and whether that could be used to monitor corruption and what is the risk of privacy and data protection, whether the companies have those practices in place and what can be done. Are we already tech savvy and are we in a position to sort of adapt it? Did I get the question right? That's right, okay. So I would say yes, technology, AI, ChatGPT, and all these kind of things are the current topics we are talking about. And yes, companies do continuously look at monitoring mechanisms. Personally, at the moment, we don't engage for monitoring corruption. There is no involvement of technology, but of course, in other aspects of the company, we are using it in terms of privacy and data protection. There are measures taken by the company to ensure that it is well in place, and there is a policy to ensure there are safeguards. So if we were to implement such a system to sort of stop human intervention and have a system to monitor corruption, prevent fraud, I suppose the safeguards are in place, and that might be a good way to go, but we are not there as yet, hopefully in the near future.
And that's also a good kind of, plug to the report, because I saw that one of the recommendation is digitization and digitalization. So certainly, there is room and scope for us to improve, on that area. Just before I close out, is there any final thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with? Averil, Rushka?
So back to the beginning, where integrity starts with each one of us, 22 million people in this country, all standing up to say no to corruption. And to understand the different ways in which corruption actually happens. It's not just paying a bribe or receiving a bribe. It's a promise. It includes a promise to pay, or you imply a payment after an event, not just before getting your plan passed or whatever, but a reward after that. That also can amount to an illegal gratuity. So understanding what exactly is corruption is important. And collectively standing up in our own organizations and as individuals, just saying no. If we all do that, we would definitely advance several steps in this country.
I would just say probably one thing, saying that combining a structure of compliance-based ethics guided by morals and integrity-based ethics, companies and organizations can create a robust ethical culture which is also sustainable. It's just not merely complying, but it would be sustainable and it would continue to grow in the business, and those values will be created. And as I initially also said, integrity should be integrated into the company, and it should be the way of life rather than the exception.
Thank you very much. May I take this opportunity to thank both our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for your time and thought, and for the audience for patiently listening and for the interesting questions. I hand it back to TISL.
Thank you. I would like to ask the distinguished panelists to remain on the stage for a moment.